Blood stained the porch of the dilapidated cabin at the edge of the Whispering Woods. 20 bodies, broken and shivering, huddled around a fire, kept alive by a woman deemed too weak to matter. 24 hours earlier, Hazel had been violently rejected, stripped of her rank, and left to freeze. Yet, while the so-called elite wolves locked their fortress doors against the worst ambush in a century, the outcast Omega held the line. By dawn, the snow would be red, the reigning pack would be begging for mercy, and the most feared Alpha King in the world would be on his knees before her. Frost clung to the windows of Oak Haven Diner, a mundane human establishment serving as a neutral zone for the Black Ridge Pack. Hazel wiped down the laminate counter, her hands smelling of cheap bleach and burnt coffee. She was an Omega, the lowest tier of the pack hierarchy, meant for service, peacekeeping, and taking the brunt of the pack's displaced aggression. But she had a secret that kept her going. Her fated mate was Caleb, the soon-to-be alpha of Black Ridge. They had kept it quiet, waiting for his official ascension ceremony before making the announcement, or so she thought. The diner bell chimed, and Caleb strode in. He wasn't alone. Clinging to his muscular arm was Savannah, a high-ranking Delta female from a neighboring territory, dripping in wealth and smug superiority. The diner, usually buzzing with the mundane chatter of humans like Sheriff Thomas Patterson and local mechanic Bill Henderson, fell dead silent as the pack members present felt the shift in the air. Caleb stopped in front of Hazel's section. He didn't look at her with the warmth of a mate. His eyes were cold, calculated, and devoid of the bond they shared. "Hazel," Caleb said, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. It wasn't a greeting. It was an execution. "I, Caleb Reed, future alpha of the Black Ridge Pack, reject you, Hazel Brooks, as my mate and future Luna." The words hit her chest like a shotgun blast. The mate bond, a tangible, glowing thread of magic connecting their souls, snapped violently. Hazel gasped, clutching the edge of the counter as an agonizing, tearing pain ripped through her chest. Blood rushed to her ears, drowning out the gasp from Mrs. Gable, the human bakery owner sitting in the corner booth. "Caleb." Hazel choked out, her vision blurring. "Why? Look at yourself," Savannah sneered, adjusting her designer coat. "You're wiping counters for minimum wage. You possess no combat skills, no political leverage, and no alpha blood. Black Ridge needs a queen, not a maid." "It's just business, Hazel," Caleb added, his tone entirely devoid of empathy. "Furthermore, your presence here is a liability. As my rejected mate, the pack dynamic will be destabilized if you remain in the Central Territory. You are hereby reassigned to the old Miller Boundary Cabin on the Northern Ridge, effective immediately." The Northern Ridge. It was miles away from the safety of the Packlands, practically brushing up against the lawless rogue territories. Sending an Omega there in the middle of winter was a death sentence. "You can't do that," Hazel whispered, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the profound betrayal. "There's a severe weather warning. Meteorologist David Clark just announced a Category 3 blizzard hitting tonight. You're sending me out there to die." Caleb turned his back on her. "Pack law is absolute. Be gone by sunset, Omega." By 5 p.m., Hazel was throwing her meager belongings into the back of her rusted 1998 Ford Ranger. The sky above Oak Haven was turning a bruised, violent purple. The wind was already howling, stripping the last dead leaves from the oaks. Her heart was a hollow, bleeding cavity, but beneath the grief, a quiet, unfamiliar spark of anger began to ignite. She was an Omega, yes, but Omegas were the survivors. They endured. The drive to the Miller Boundary Cabin was treacherous. The roads were slick with black ice, and the radio crackled with static as local news anchors warned residents to stay indoors. The cabin itself was a decaying wooden structure, abandoned by the pack a decade ago after an unsolved rogue attack. It had no central heating, just a massive stone fireplace and drafts that whistled like crying children. Hazel spent the first few hours chopping whatever dry wood she could find in the shed, her muscles burning, her tears finally freezing on her cheeks. She boarded up the broken windows using rusty nails and old pallets. She was entirely alone. The pack link in her mind, the comforting hum of hundreds of wolves sharing a collective consciousness, had been severed by Caleb's rejection. The silence in her head was deafening. As night fell, the blizzard slammed into the mountain. The temperature plummeted to -15. Hazel huddled by the fire, wrapped in 3 thin blankets, trying to convince herself that she would survive the night. Then, over the roar of the wind, she heard it. It wasn't the howl of the storm. It was the distinct, agonizing scream of a wolf in mortal danger. Hazel shot to her feet, the blanket falling to the floorboards. She crept to the boarded-up window and peered through a crack in the wood. The snow was falling so thick it was like a white sheet had been draped over the world, but the heavy, metallic scent of blood cut straight through the cold air. Gunfire echoed in the distance, heavy, rapid bursts of silver-laced artillery. Hunters? No. Hunters didn't move in blizzards. This was an organized hit. A faction war. Suddenly, a heavy thud rattled the front door. Hazel stumbled backward, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Pack law was clear. Omegas did not engage. Omegas hid. Another thud, followed by a weak, frantic scratching. "Please," a voice gasped from the other side. It was a human voice, hoarse and desperate. "Please, by the goddess, open the door. We have pups." That word pups bypassed every instinct of self-preservation in Hazel's brain. An Omega's core directive, stronger than fear, was the protection of the young and the vulnerable. She threw the deadbolt and yanked the heavy oak door open. The sight before her stole her breath. A towering man stood on the porch, covered in snow and soaking in his own blood. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, and a silver bullet was deeply embedded in his shoulder. He wasn't from Blackridge. He smelled of ancient pine, petrichor, and an overwhelming, suffocating aura of power, even in his weakened state. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, huddled on the freezing porch, were 19 others. There were 4 severely injured warriors, their bodies shredded by silver shrapnel. There were 3 elders, shivering uncontrollably, their lips blue from the cold. And clustered in the center, shielded by the bodies of the adults, were 12 terrified children, ranging from toddlers to young teenagers. 20 wolves in total. Ambush. The massive man choked out, falling to his knees as his strength finally gave out. Blackwood Cartel. They hit our transport. You're Alpha. Caleb. He denied us entry at the border, closed the gates on us. Hazel felt a sickening jolt in her stomach. Caleb had left children outside the borders to be slaughtered by a cartel. "Get inside," Hazel ordered, her voice completely devoid of the usual submissive Omega tremor. She grabbed the massive man by his good shoulder and hauled him over the threshold. "Everyone move, quickly." The 20 refugees spilled into the tiny, freezing cabin. The children were crying silently, a trauma response. The warriors collapsed on the floorboards, leaving streaks of crimson across the wood. Hazel slammed the door shut and locked it. She turned to face the room. 20 pairs of eyes, wide with pain and desperation, stared back at her. She was a rejected Omega with a broken heart, a rusted fire poker, and a half-stocked first aid kit. But looking at these bleeding strangers, the hollow void Caleb had left behind filled with a sudden, fierce purpose. "I am Commander Wyatt." The large man wheezed from the floor, trying to push himself up. "We are the vanguard of the royal court. We were escorting the Alpha King's extended family to the Winter Solstice Summit. The Blackwood rogues. They knew our route. They have silver-laced gas. We lost half our convoy." Hazel's blood ran cold. The royal court. The Alpha King's family. And Caleb had left them to die because he was too cowardly to risk engaging the Blackwood cartel. If the Alpha King found out, the Blackridge pack would be erased from the map. "We need a healer," an elderly woman rasped, clutching a bleeding toddler to her chest. "Are you the pack doctor?" "No," Hazel said honestly, moving swiftly toward the bathroom. "I'm a diner waitress. But I'm all you've got." She dragged out an old medical duffel left behind by Dr. Arthur Hendricks, the pack physician who had used this cabin a decade ago. It was dusty, but the supplies were sealed. "Okay, listen to me," Hazel commanded. The authority in her voice surprised even herself. It commanded the room. A soothing but firm frequency that immediately lowered the frantic heart rates of the children. "Elders, take the pups to the back bedroom. Get under the quilts, share body heat. Do not let them fall asleep until they stop shivering." She turned to Wyatt and the 3 other warriors. "You 4, drag yourselves to the fire. I need to get the silver out of you before it poisons your bloodstreams." "You don't understand," Wyatt coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. "The rogues. They are tracking our blood trail. They are coming. We brought them right to your door." "Let them come," Hazel said, grabbing a pair of medical forceps and a bottle of high-proof whiskey from the cupboard. "This is my territory tonight, and nobody dies on my floor." The storm raged outside, a chaotic symphony of howling wind and snapping timber, but inside the cabin, the tension was a physical weight. Hazel worked with a manic, hyper-focused efficiency. She wasn't a trained surgeon, but Omegas inherently possessed an innate understanding of wolf anatomy and healing. She knelt beside Commander Wyatt. "This is going to hurt," she warned, pouring the cheap whiskey directly into the gaping wound on his shoulder. Wyatt roared in agony, his eyes flashing a brilliant, dangerous gold, his fangs extending. An alpha's pain response could be lethal to anyone nearby, but Hazel didn't flinch. She placed a firm, steady hand on his chest, releasing a wave of calming omega pheromones, a scent like warm vanilla and rain. Wyatt's eyes widened in shock as his heart rate instantly stabilized. "You're an omega," he breathed, staring at her as she dug the forceps into his flesh. "Observant," Hazel muttered, clamping down on the silver bullet and yanking it out. The metallic clink as she dropped the bullet into a tin bucket echoed in the quiet room. She quickly packed the wound with gauze and stitched it up with rapid, precise movements. She moved seamlessly from warrior to warrior. She bound cracked ribs, stitched lacerations, and brewed a thick, foul-smelling tea from willow bark and dried herbs she found in the pantry to break the elders' fevers. By 2 a.m., the bleeding had stopped. The children were asleep in a massive pile in the back room, kept warm by the elders. But the real threat was closing in. Through the howling wind, Hazel's sensitive ears picked up the sound of crunching snow. It wasn't the rhythmic pacing of a patrol. It was the heavy, disorganized dragging of boots and paws. The Blackwood cartel had arrived. "They're here," whispered Jax, one of the younger royal guards whose leg Hazel had just splinted. He tried to stand, but collapsed with a groan. "We can't fight them. We have no weapons." "Stay down," Hazel ordered. She walked to the fireplace and grabbed the bucket of ash she had been saving. "Wyatt, how many of them?" Wyatt closed his eyes, extending his senses despite his injuries. Hazel's mind raced. 15 armed rogues against 1 unshifted Omega, 4 crippled warriors, and a bunch of kids. Brute force was out of the question. She had to use her environment. She walked to the front door and began to pile every heavy piece of furniture against it, the oak dining table, the heavy cast iron stove she managed to drag across the floor, breaking her fingernails in the process. "What are you doing?" Wyatt asked, watching her with a mixture of awe and confusion. "A barricade won't hold them. They'll just break the windows." "I know," Hazel said. She grabbed the bucket of ash and began rapidly mixing it with a bottle of industrial drain cleaner she found under the sink, creating a highly caustic, blinding powder. "But it will funnel them to the back door." Suddenly, the front door shuddered under a massive impact. The wood splintered. "Open up, little piggies," a raspy, deranged voice called from outside. It was a rogue, his voice distorted by madness. "We know the royal brats are in there. Hand them over, and we might let the rest of you die fast." Hazel ignored him. She moved to the back door, a narrow wooden frame leading out to the small mudroom. She popped the lock and left the door cracked open exactly 2 inches. Above the doorframe, she balanced the heavy iron tin filled with the caustic ash mixture, tying a thin tripwire from the bucket to the doorknob. It was a crude, desperate trap, reminiscent of the pranks she used to play on the pack teens, but weaponized. "If they get inside," Hazel told the warriors, grabbing her fire poker and standing in the center of the room, "protect the bedroom door. Nobody touches those pups." A deafening crash echoed as the rogues, realizing the front door was too heavily barricaded, smashed through the mudroom window. Footsteps thundered toward the cracked back door. "Gotcha!" a rogue snarled, kicking the back door wide open. The tripwire snapped. The iron bucket tipped, dumping 5 pounds of caustic, chemical-laced ash directly onto the faces of the first 3 rogues rushing through the doorway. Screams of pure agony ripped through the cabin as the chemicals burned their eyes and the ash choked their lungs. They dropped their weapons, clawing at their own faces, completely blinded. Hazel didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron fire poker with all the pent-up rage and grief of her rejection. She slammed it into the knee of the first blinded rogue, shattering the joint with a sickening crack. As he fell, she brought the heavy iron down on his temple, knocking him unconscious. "Get in there," the rogue leader outside bellowed. 2 more massive wolves, fully shifted into their beast forms, squeezed through the doorway, bypassing their blinded comrades. They were monstrous, their fur matted with blood, their eyes glowing with rabid hunger. One lunged directly at Hazel. She dove under its snapping jaws, feeling the rush of air as its teeth missed her throat by an inch. She rolled across the floorboards, coming up near the fireplace. The wolf scrambled on the slippery floorboards, turning to strike again. Suddenly, a massive, deafening roar shook the very foundation of the cabin. Wyatt, despite his shattered shoulder, had forced himself into a partial shift. His eyes burned with royal gold. He tackled the rogue wolf midair, pinning it to the ground and sinking his teeth into its neck. The sickening crunch of bone ended the threat instantly. But the second wolf was already at the bedroom door, sniffing the terrified children inside. "No!" Hazel screamed. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She sprinted across the room and leaped onto the massive wolf's back, wrapping her arms around its thick neck and driving her thumbs directly into its eyes. The beast thrashed wildly, slamming Hazel into the drywall. Pain exploded in her ribs, but she held on, screaming in defiance. The wolf reared back, ready to crush her against the ceiling beams, when Jax, the young guard with the splinted leg, managed to throw a silver dagger he had retrieved from the fallen rogues. The blade buried itself deep into the wolf's ribcage. The beast collapsed, pinning Hazel's leg underneath its massive weight. Silence fell over the cabin, save for the howling wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. The remaining rogues outside, hearing the brutal deaths of their vanguard and sensing the sheer suicidal ferocity waiting inside, decided the bounty wasn't worth the blood. Their footsteps retreated into the blizzard. Hazel lay on the floor, gasping for air, her vision swimming with black spots. Wyatt dragged the dead wolf off her leg, offering her a bloody hand to help her up. "You," Wyatt panted, looking at the tiny, battered waitress with profound reverence. "You are no ordinary Omega." Hazel leaned heavily against the wall, spitting a mixture of blood and dirt onto the floor. "I'm an Omega who is very, very tired of being pushed around." They had survived the night. But as the first pale light of dawn began to break through the cracks in the boarded windows, a new, far more terrifying sound echoed across the mountain ridge. It wasn't a rogue howl. It was a single, earth-shattering roar of an alpha. A roar so powerful it made the floorboards vibrate and forced Wyatt and his guards to instantly drop to their knees in absolute submission. The Alpha King had arrived. And he was hunting for his family. The sheer force of the Alpha King's roar did not just echo. It shattered the remaining glass in the mudroom and sent a shockwave of raw, unadulterated kinetic energy through the floorboards. The surviving Vanguard warriors, even the towering Commander Wyatt, were immediately forced to the ground, their foreheads pressed against the freezing wood in a display of absolute, instinctual submission. The elders wept in the back bedroom, a mixture of profound relief and bone-deep terror. Hazel, however, did not kneel. Her legs were trembling so violently they threatened to give out. Her ribs screamed in agony from being crushed against the drywall, and her lungs burned from the chemical dust in the air. Yet, the Omega instinct that had kept her fighting all night acted as an anchor. The pups were behind her. Until she knew this new, terrifying presence wasn't a threat to the children, her body refused to submit. She gripped the bloodied iron fire poker, planting her boots firmly in the center of the room. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched through the snow on the porch. The barricade Hazel had painstakingly built the heavy oak table, the cast iron stove, the broken pallets was violently blasted inward. The heavy oak door didn't just open. It was ripped entirely off its iron hinges, flying across the room and smashing into the opposite wall. Through the swirling vortex of the morning blizzard stepped Silas Hawthorne. To the human world, Silas was a ghost, a reclusive, billionaire industrialist who controlled global shipping logistics from the shadows, with political ties reaching as far as Governor Bradley Jenkins and Senator William Hayes. To the werewolf world, he was the apex predator. He stood 6'4", draped in a tactical winter coat that did nothing to hide the broad, lethal lines of his physique. His face was a masterpiece of harsh, unforgiving angles, shadowed by exhaustion and a murderous, feral rage. His eyes were entirely eclipsed by glowing, molten gold, the mark of an Alpha King, pushed to the absolute brink of his control. Silas stepped into the cabin, the heavy scent of cedar, lightning, and ancient power flooding the room, suffocating in its intensity. He scanned the carnage. He saw the dead rogue wolf on the floor, its skull crushed. He saw the chemical burns on the walls, the pools of blood, the crude medical supplies. "My king," Wyatt rasped from the floorboards, not daring to lift his head. "We held the line. We have the pups." Silas's chest heaved. The feral gold in his eyes flickered, receding just enough to show the storm-gray irises beneath. He took a step further into the cabin, and then he saw her. Hazel stood directly in his path to the bedroom. She was a bruised, battered, 90-pound waitress in a torn, blood-soaked uniform from Oak Haven Diner. Her knuckles were split. Her face was smeared with soot and rogue blood, and she was pointing a bent fire poker directly at the chest of the most powerful wolf on the planet. "Stand down," Silas commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated right through Hazel's bones. It was a royal command, a psychic weight that should have dropped an Omega into immediate unconsciousness. Hazel gritted her teeth, blood leaking from a cut on her bottom lip. Not until you step back from the door. The pups are resting. You're scaring them. A collective gasp echoed from the vanguard warriors on the floor. Jax, the young guard, squeezed his eyes shut, fully expecting the king to tear the insolent Omega's head from her shoulders. No one defied the king. Not even High Council alphas dared to look him in the eye, let alone dictate terms to him. Silas froze. He looked at the trembling, ferocious woman standing before him. He inhaled sharply, drawing in the scent of the cabin. Beneath the overwhelming stench of copper blood, caustic chemicals, and wet fur, a delicate, impossible scent hit the back of his throat. Warm vanilla and summer rain. It cut through his feral rage like a scalpel. The scent bypassed his logical brain and struck directly at his soul. For 3 centuries, the Hawthorne bloodline had suffered the curse of the unmatched. Silas had reigned alone, a ruthless, isolated monarch who had long ago accepted that the goddess had not crafted a mate for him. But as he stared at Hazel, a blinding physical jolt of pure magic erupted in his chest. A golden thread of energy, visible only to their inner wolves, shot across the room, wrapping tightly around Hazel's bleeding heart and tethering it violently to his own. Hazel dropped the fire poker. It clattered loudly against the floor. She staggered back, clutching her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Just 24 hours ago, Caleb had severed her mate bond, leaving a ragged, agonizing void. Now, that void was being filled with a rushing, overwhelming tide of golden warmth, fierce protection, and absolute devotion. Mate, Silas's inner wolf roared, a sound of pure, possessive triumph that echoed only in Hazel's mind. The Alpha King did not attack. He did not issue another command. Instead, to the absolute shock of his elite guard, Silas Hawthorne dropped to his knees on the blood-soaked floorboards. He reached out with trembling, blood-stained hands, not to strike her, but to gently grasp her bruised wrists. You, Silas breathed, his voice stripped of its harsh authority, replaced by a raw, desperate reverence. He looked up at her, the storm gray of his eyes completely clear, brimming with unshed emotion. You protected them. They were knocking, Hazel whispered, her voice cracking as the exhaustion finally, completely took over. The adrenaline flatlined. Her knees buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. He gathered her battered body into his massive arms, pulling her flush against his chest. The warmth radiating from him was a narcotic. Hazel buried her face in the collar of his tactical coat, breathing in the scent of cedar and lightning, feeling the steady, thundering heartbeat of the king against her cheek. Wyatt, Silas said, his voice instantly returning to its lethal, commanding edge, though he never took his eyes off Hazel's bruised face. Report. Now. Who did this? And why was a royal convoy seeking shelter in an abandoned boundary cabin? Wyatt struggled to a seated position, clutching his patched shoulder. The Blackwood cartel ambushed us on Interstate 95, just past Mayor Harrison's county line. They used military-grade silver gas. We lost 6 guards. We requested emergency sanctuary from the Black Ridge Pack. Alpha Caleb denied us entry. He sealed the perimeter and left us to the rogues. A terrifying, dead silence fell over the room. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caleb Reed left my elders and my children outside his gates to be slaughtered? Silas asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was the calm before a catastrophic hurricane. Yes, Your Majesty, Wyatt confirmed. If not for this Omega, if she had not defied pack law and opened her door, dragging us inside and fighting off the vanguard of the cartel, we would all be dead. She fought a fully shifted rogue with nothing but a fire poker and her bare hands. Silas looked down at Hazel, who was barely conscious, her fingers weakly clutching the fabric of his coat. He saw the rejection mark on her neck, a bruised, fading scar where Caleb's pack bond had been forcefully ripped away. He pieced the puzzle together in a fraction of a second. Caleb had cast out his own mate, sent her to a death trap in a blizzard, and then condemned the royal family to the same fate. Rest, my brave Luna, Silas whispered softly into Hazel's ear, pressing his lips to her bruised forehead. I have you now, and the snow will turn red before anyone ever hurts you again. By 8 a.m., the blizzard had broken, leaving the Whispering Woods buried under 3 feet of pristine, glittering snow. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the ridge. But the silence of the morning was shattered by the roar of 6 heavily armored, matte black SUVs tearing up the mountain road. Caleb Reed stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by his newly chosen Luna, Savannah, and 20 of his most elite Black Ridge enforcers. Caleb wore a tailored winter coat, his hair perfectly styled. He had timed his arrival perfectly. He expected to find the cabin burnt to the ground, the royal vanguard decimated, and his problematic ex-mate, Hazel, conveniently eliminated by the cartel. He was ready to play the devastated local alpha who had arrived just minutes too late to stop the tragedy, solidifying his political narrative. Ugh, the smell of cheap blood and burnt wood, Savannah complained, covering her nose with a gloved hand. Let's get this over with, Caleb. We have a press conference with the local human authorities at noon to discuss the wild animal attacks. Caleb nodded solemnly to his beta. Secure the perimeter. If there are any rogue bodies, burn them. If the Omega is dead, leave her in the snow. I want a clean crime scene. He marched up the steps to the porch, stepping over the shattered remains of the heavy oak door. Hello? Caleb called out, projecting a fake tone of urgent concern. Is anyone alive in here? This is Alpha Caleb of Black Ridge. He stepped over the threshold, and the blood froze in his veins. The cabin was not empty. It was heavily occupied. The Royal Vanguard warriors were not dead. They were sitting by a roaring fire, their wounds professionally bandaged. The elders and pups were huddled together, drinking warm broth, completely unharmed. And standing in the center of the room, flanked by two towering royal executioners who had arrived by helicopter an hour prior, was King Silas Hawthorne. Silas wasn't looking at Caleb. He was meticulously, gently wrapping a thick, cashmere blanket around the shoulders of a woman sitting on the only intact chair in the room. As the woman turned her head, Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was Hazel. She was cleaned of the soot, her bruised face treated with high-grade royal healing salves. She looked exhausted, but there was a new, undeniable aura radiating from her, a heavy, suffocating scent of power, protection, and sovereignty. She smelled exactly like the Alpha King. What is this? Caleb stammered, taking an involuntary step backward as the crushing pressure of the king's presence hit him like a physical blow. Savannah, standing behind him, let out a choked whimper and immediately dropped to her knees, her beta instincts forcing her into submission. Silas slowly turned to face Caleb. The king's eyes were completely dark. Alpha Caleb, Silas said, his voice echoing in the small cabin, laced with a dangerous, terrifying politeness. How kind of you to join us. I trust your drive up the mountain was comfortable? Your Majesty. Caleb immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head, though his mind was racing in sheer panic. We came as soon as the storm broke. We picked up distress signals on the border scanners. I am horrified by this tragedy. If you had known, Hazel's voice cut through the air. It wasn't the timid, submissive voice of the waitress he had fired yesterday. It was firm, grounded, and edged with steel. Caleb's head snapped up. He glared at her, old habits dying hard. Silence, Omega. Do not speak out of turn in the presence of the king. Before Caleb could even blink, Silas crossed the room in a blur of motion. He didn't shift. He didn't use a weapon. He simply grabbed Caleb by the throat with one massive hand and lifted the 200-pound Alpha off the ground as easily as if he were a rag doll. Caleb gasped, his hands clawing uselessly at the king's iron grip, his feet kicking in the air. You will never speak to her in that tone again, Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. You will never address her as Omega. You are speaking to my fated mate. You are speaking to the Luna Queen of the United Pax. Savannah screamed from the floor. The Black Ridge enforcers outside drew their weapons, but the royal executioners merely stepped onto the porch, their eyes glowing with ancient, bloodthirsty power, and the local wolves immediately dropped their silver guns, surrendering on the spot. Silas threw Caleb across the room. The Alpha crashed into the wall, splintering the drywall, and collapsed in a heap, coughing up blood. You rejected her, Silas sneered, stepping over Caleb's broken form. You stripped her of her rank, broke her bond, and sent her here to freeze. You deemed her weak. Yet, while you locked yourself behind your reinforced gates, shivering in the dark, my queen stood her ground. She broke the vanguard of the Blackwood cartel with her bare hands. She saved my family. She is 10 times the wolf you will ever be. Caleb scrambled backward, spitting blood. My king, please. I made a mistake. The cartel. They were too heavily armed. I had to protect my pack. I couldn't risk the lives of my people for a convoy. A lie, a frail, raspy voice interrupted. Elder Beatrice, the oldest of the royal family, stepped out from the back bedroom. She leaned heavily on a cane, but her eyes burned with centuries of sharp, calculating intelligence. In her hand, she held a thick, blood-stained leather ledger. We didn't just stumble upon an ambush, Your Majesty, Beatrice addressed Silas, though her glare was fixed entirely on Caleb. During the fight, Commander Wyatt managed to tear the coat off the rogue leader before he retreated. This ledger fell from his pocket. Beatrice tossed the ledger onto the floorboards, right at Caleb's feet. It details shipping routes, financial transfers, and border access codes, Beatrice continued, her voice echoing like a death knell. It shows a direct transfer of $5 million human dollars into an offshore account owned by Black Ridge. It also shows the exact patrol schedules of your border guards, modified specifically to leave the Interstate 95 entry point completely undefended between midnight and 3 a.m. Hazel stared at Caleb, horrified realization washing over her. You didn't just deny them entry, Caleb. You set them up. Caleb's face went completely pale. No, it's a forgery. The cartel is framing me. They used Mayor Harrison's shipping routes. I had nothing to do with it. Do not insult my intelligence, Silas growled, stepping heavily on Caleb's ankle. A sickening snap echoed through the room, followed by Caleb's agonizing scream. You sold my family's location to the Blackwood cartel in exchange for silver-laced weaponry and a seat on the High Council. You thought you could eliminate the royal heirs, blame the rogues, and rise in the political vacuum. Silas turned his back on the pathetic, whimpering Alpha and looked at Hazel. The rage in his eyes melted into profound respect and unwavering devotion. Hazel, Silas said, holding out his hand to her. Under royal law, treason against the crown is punishable by immediate execution. But this man broke your heart before he tried to break my family. His fate belongs to you. What is your judgment, my queen? Hazel stood up. The cashmere blanket slipped from her shoulders. She looked at Caleb, the man she had loved, the man who had humiliated her in front of the entire town, the man who had left innocent children to be butchered in the snow. She felt no lingering attachment. The golden thread in her chest, tethering her to Silas, pulsed with strong, steady reassurance. She didn't want him dead. Death was too quick, too honorable a release for a coward. Strip him, Hazel said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the freezing morning air. Strip him of his alpha status. Strip him of his wealth, his pack, and his name. Brand him with the mark of the exile, and let him wander the rogue territories as an omega. Let him survive the winters just as he expected me to. Silas smiled a dark, terrifyingly proud smile. As you command, my Luna. The stripping of an alpha was a brutal, ancient ritual, rarely witnessed and never forgotten. Outside the ruined boundary cabin, the morning sun reflected blindingly off the fresh snow, offering a stark contrast to the dark judgment unfolding. Silas Hawthorne stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his storm-gray eyes devoid of mercy. At his command, the two royal executioners stepped forward. They did not use silver. They used the raw, crushing weight of royal dominance. They forced Caleb to his hands and knees in the freezing snow. Savannah, Caleb's newly minted Luna, had already fled to the tree line, weeping hysterically, her loyalty evaporating the moment Caleb's power was broken. By the blood of the vanguard and the decree of the crown, Silas's voice boomed, resonating through the whispering woods, forcing every bird to take flight and every hidden woodland creature to cower. I strip you of your title. I strip you of your pack link. I sever your connection to the earth of Black Ridge. Caleb screamed a guttural, agonizing sound that tore from the very bottom of his soul. The golden aura of alpha command that usually surrounded him shattered like cheap glass. His muscles visibly atrophied, his broad frame shrinking as the ancient magic abandoned him, leaving him nothing more than a baseline, broken wolf. One of the executioners drew a heated iron blade from a portable forge they had brought in the SUVs, pressing it mercilessly against Caleb's right shoulder blade. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as the mark of the exile, a jagged, broken circle, was seared into his skin forever. Leave our territory, Hazel said, stepping onto the edge of the porch. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the weight of her new reality. If you are found within 100 miles of Oakhaven or the Royal Estates by nightfall, you will be hunted for sport. Caleb, weeping and clutching his branded shoulder, stumbled into the deep snow, disappearing into the treacherous rogue territories without a backward glance. However, the werewolf world did not exist in a vacuum. The cartel ambush on Interstate 95 had left a massive, burning debris field that human authorities could not ignore. Within an hour, local sirens wailed in the distance. Silas pulled a sleek satellite phone from his tactical coat. He wasn't just an Alpha King. He was a master of the modern human world. Get me District Attorney Robert Hughes on the encrypted line, Silas barked to a shadowy operative on the other end. Tell him there was an industrial chemical spill involving one of Hawthorne Logistics' transport fleets. Yes, Mayor Harrison's jurisdiction. I want a complete media blackout. Deploy our private cleanup crews before Sheriff Thomas Patterson gets his deputies out there. I will double their precinct's annual funding as an anonymous donation for their cooperation. Hazel watched him work, mesmerized. Silas commanded human politicians and billionaires just as easily as he commanded feral wolves. He hung up the phone and turned to her, his harsh, authoritative expression instantly softening into something incredibly tender. It's done, Silas said, stepping onto the porch and wrapping his thick coat securely around her shivering frame. The humans will see nothing but a tragic traffic accident. The pack will be temporarily governed by Commander Wyatt until a suitable, loyal alpha is appointed. And you, my brave Luna, are going home. The journey to the royal estate in Aspen, Colorado, was a blur of private jets, armored motorcades, and a level of luxury Hazel had only ever seen in magazines left behind at the Oak Haven diner. Silas refused to leave her side. During the flight, Dr. Eris Mitchell, the chief royal physician, carefully treated her fractured ribs and chemical burns. Through it all, Silas held her hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles against her skin, feeding her his golden, calming energy through their newly forged mate bond. Why me? Hazel asked quietly as they flew 30,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. The exhaustion was setting in, but her mind was racing. You are the king. You could have any highborn female from any continent. I served coffee. I have no pedigree. Silas leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. Pedigree is a human invention, Hazel. The goddess does not care about bank accounts or social climbing. She cares about the heart. Yesterday, you were stripped of everything. You were freezing, heartbroken, and completely alone. Yet, when faced with a violent ambush, you didn't run. You opened your door to strangers. You fought a monster with your bare hands to protect children that weren't yours. You have more queen in your pinky finger than the entire High Council possesses in their collective bloodlines. He kissed her softly, a promise sealed in breath and magic. You are exactly what my kingdom needs, and exactly what my soul has been begging for. But as the jet descended toward the sprawling, fortress-like Hawthorne estate nestled in the snow-capped peaks, Hazel's instincts, the same instincts that had kept her alive in the cabin, began to hum with a quiet, persistent warning. The danger wasn't over. Caleb had been a pawn, and pawns didn't orchestrate military-grade ambushes on their own. The Winter Solstice Summit was the most important political event of the decade. The Hawthorne Estate's Grand Hall was an architectural marvel of dark mahogany, soaring vaulted ceilings, and massive crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of alphas, lunas, and dignitaries from across the globe had gathered, dressed in millions of dollars of couture. Hazel stood in the antechamber, wearing a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk, custom designed by the royal tailors. A delicate, diamond-encrusted diadem rested in her dark hair. She looked every inch a queen, but her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Tonight, Silas would formally present her to the High Council and crown her Luna of the United Pax. But there was a growing rot beneath the surface of the glittering ballroom. For the past 3 days, Hazel had been secretly reviewing the bloody ledger Elder Beatrice had salvaged from the rogue. Silas had been preoccupied with securing the borders, so Hazel had taken it upon herself to dig into the finances. While working at the diner, she had handled the books for years, balancing tight margins and spotting discrepancies. Werewolf or human, numbers never lied. She had traced the $5 million that went to Caleb's offshore account. But she noticed something else, a secondary, recurring transfer of massive sums funneled through shell corporations tied to Hawthorne Logistics. The cartel wasn't just buying Caleb's silence. They were being funded from inside the royal court. Nervous? Silas asked, entering the antechamber. He looked devastatingly handsome in a tailored black suit, the aura of the king radiating from him in heavy, intoxicating waves. Silas, Hazel said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She pulled the ledger from a hidden compartment in the antique vanity table. I need you to look at this, before we go out there. Silas frowned, stepping closer. Hazel, we reviewed this. It's Caleb's treason. No. Look at the routing numbers on page 42, Hazel insisted, tapping the dried bloodstains covering the ink. The account that paid Caleb. It's a subsidiary of Sterling Holdings. I cross-referenced the tax identification numbers using the estate's secure terminal. Silas's eyes widened, the storm gray darkening into thunderous black. Sterling Holdings. Lord Gregory Sterling, Silas growled, his jaw clenching so hard it looked carved from granite. Lord Gregory was Silas's most trusted advisor, the head of the High Council, and the man who had overseen the security details for the royal convoy. He sent the convoy on Interstate 95, Hazel whispered. Gregory funded the Blackwood cartel to wipe out your extended family, knowing you would blame the rogues and the local alpha. If your heirs died, Gregory's bloodline was next in line for the throne. A terrifying, lethal silence fell over Silas. He didn't explode in rage. The king simply went completely, deathly still. He is in the ballroom right now, drinking my champagne. Then let's go crown a queen, Hazel said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung open. The room fell utterly silent as Silas Hawthorne and Hazel Brooks descended the grand staircase. The collective power of their mate bond rolled over the crowd like a physical shockwave. Some alphas had to brace themselves against the tables. Silas led Hazel to the dais at the front of the room. He didn't bother with the traditional, long-winded ceremonial speeches. 3 nights ago, Silas's voice rang out, cold and sharp as a guillotine. My family was ambushed by the Blackwood cartel. They survived only through the unmatched bravery of the woman standing beside me. Hazel Brooks, my fated mate, and your new Luna. Polite, strained applause rippled through the room. Lord Gregory Sterling, a tall, silver-haired aristocrat with a perfectly tailored tuxedo and a condescending smile, stepped forward from the front row. Your Majesty, we rejoice at the finding of your mate, Lord Gregory said smoothly, raising his glass. But the High Council must respectfully ask, is it wise to crown a former Omega? A woman with no political training, who until yesterday was serving humans in a diner? The crown requires pedigree. Hazel didn't wait for Silas to defend her. She stepped forward, looking down at the aristocratic traitor. Pedigree is a human invention, Lord Gregory, Hazel said, perfectly echoing Silas's words. I may have served humans, but I learned a very valuable skill. I learned how to read a ledger. Lord Gregory's condescending smile faltered. A single bead of sweat broke out on his temple. Hazel signaled Commander Wyatt, who stepped out from the shadows of the pillars, holding the blood-stained ledger. This ledger belonged to the cartel, Hazel projected her voice, letting the acoustics of the hall carry her absolute authority. It details the exact routing numbers from Sterling Holdings, funneling millions to fund the ambush on the royal family. You armed the rogues. You set up Alpha Caleb as the fall guy. You tried to murder the king's family to steal the throne. The grand hall erupted into chaos. Gasps of horror and snarls of outrage echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Lies. Lord Gregory roared, his eyes flashing wolf gold. He lunged toward the dais, fully intending to rip Hazel's throat out before she could say another word. He never made it past the first step. Silas moved faster than the eye could track. He intercepted the High Council Lord, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo and slamming him brutally into the marble floor. The impact cracked the stone. Silas shifted partially, his fangs extending, his roar shattering the crystal champagne flutes on the nearby tables. Treason! Silas snarled, his voice a demonic, overlapping echo of man and beast. You tried to kill my blood. You tried to humiliate my mate. You will not have the luxury of exile. Before the High Council could even draw a breath, Silas ripped Lord Gregory's throat out. The aristocrat choked, his blood pooling on the pristine white marble. He twitched once, and then lay dead. Silence crashed back down on the ballroom, heavy and absolute. Silas stood up, wiping the blood from his mouth with a monogrammed handkerchief handed to him by a trembling servant. He straightened his cuffs, his eyes sweeping over the terrified crowd of the world's most powerful wolves. None dared to meet his gaze. He turned to Hazel, his eyes clearing, returning to the soft, devoted storm gray. He reached out his hand. Hazel took it, her hand steady, completely unfazed by the violence. She had seen worse in the cabin. She knew what it took to protect a pack. Silas led her to the center of the dais. He picked up the ancient, heavy silver crown of the Luna Queen. My queen, Silas said, his voice ringing with absolute pride. You bowed to no one in the dark. Now, they will all bow to you in the light. He placed the crown on her head. As the cold silver touched her skin, a brilliant, blinding shockwave of golden energy erupted from their joined hands, washing over every wolf in the room. It was the purest manifestation of the goddess's blessing. One by one, the elite alphas, the arrogant lunas, and the remaining members of the High Council dropped to their knees, pressing their heads to the marble floor in total, absolute submission. Hazel stood on the balcony of the Hawthorne estate, the cold mountain air kissing her cheeks as she looked out over a kingdom that stretched far beyond the horizon. Just days ago, she had been a discarded Omega, deemed worthless by a coward who valued status over a soul. She had scrubbed floors, served coffee, and accepted her lot in life with quiet resignation. Yet, When the ultimate test arrived on her frozen doorstep, it wasn't royal blood that held the line against the darkness. It was sheer, unrelenting grit. She had protected the vulnerable when the elite had locked their doors. She had exposed the highest level of treason with the practical intelligence forged in a small-town diner. Now, the most feared king in werewolf history stood by her side, completely devoted, his hand resting securely on her waist. Hazel didn't just survive the storm, she became it.